Dean Richard Holloway believed reputation was everything, and on the night he humiliated a quiet woman in front of the entire university faculty, he thought he was protecting his legacy. What he didn't realize was that within the next 20 minutes, the very woman he mocked would unravel his career in complete silence. The grand auditorium at Blackstone University glowed beneath warm chandelier light, its polished mahogany walls reflecting the prestige the institution had cultivated for more than a century. Professors in tailored suits and elegant dresses filled the tiered seating while graduate students lined the back rows clutching notebooks and tablets. At the center of the stage stood Dean Richard Holloway, the most powerful academic figure on campus. At 58, Holloway carried himself with the confidence of a man who had spent decades being admired. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his navy suit impeccably fitted, and his voice carried the polished authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms without resistance. Tonight's faculty symposium was meant to celebrate his latest research initiative, a multi-million-dollar project that had already attracted national attention. Large screens behind him displayed complex academic charts while applause echoed through the auditorium. Near the side entrance, almost invisible against the marble walls, Evelyn Carter quietly pushed a small cart stacked with archival journals toward the faculty table. At 39, she blended into the background so naturally that most people barely noticed her presence. Her faded gray cardigan hung loosely over a simple white blouse, and her chestnut hair was tied back in a low ponytail. To most people inside Blackstone University, Evelyn was simply one of the library assistants who worked late evenings organizing historical research materials. She rarely spoke during events. She rarely looked anyone directly in the eye. And she had long ago learned that invisibility made life easier inside institutions built on ego. Holloway adjusted his microphone and smiled confidently as the applause settled. As my research clearly demonstrates, he announced, the previous theoretical limitations in institutional predictive modeling were fundamentally flawed. Several professors nodded approvingly while faculty members typed notes. Evelyn paused beside the side aisle, her eyes narrowing slightly toward the presentation screen. Something about the equations bothered her immediately. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the cart. At first she said nothing. But then Holloway displayed a slide containing a statistical framework that made her expression shift almost imperceptibly. One of the formulas had been altered. The auditorium remained silent except for the dean's voice echoing through the speakers. Evelyn hesitated. Then, very softly, she spoke. Your variable weighting is reversed in section 4. The words were quiet, almost swallowed by the room itself. But the microphone hanging above the audience picked them up clearly enough that dozens of heads turned at once. Holloway stopped mid-sentence. Slowly, he looked toward the side aisle where Evelyn stood frozen beside her cart of books. A faint smile crept across his face, the kind reserved for people he considered beneath him. I'm sorry, he said smoothly, adjusting his cufflinks. Did our library staff just attempt to critique advanced institutional analytics? A ripple of laughter moved through the auditorium. Evelyn's cheeks flushed slightly, but she remained calm. I only meant the weighting sequence may create inaccurate projections under longitudinal conditions, she said carefully. More laughter followed, louder this time. Holloway stepped away from the podium with theatrical amusement. Well, he said, smiling toward the faculty crowd, perhaps next semester we should allow librarians to peer review the mathematics department as well. The room erupted again. Several professors exchanged smirks while students looked back at Evelyn with open embarrassment. She lowered her eyes briefly, gripping the handle of the cart. But then something unexpected happened. Near the front row, Professor Harold Whitmore suddenly stopped laughing. His expression changed completely as he stared at the name printed on Evelyn's employee badge. Evelyn Carter. The color slowly drained from his face. And one by one, a few older faculty members began noticing it too. The laughter inside the auditorium faded unevenly, replaced by an uneasy stillness that spread row by row across the faculty seating. Dean Holloway noticed it immediately. At first, he assumed the silence belonged to embarrassment on Evelyn Carter's behalf. But then he followed the direction of several professors' stares and realized something had changed. Professor Harold Whitmore remained frozen in his seat near the front row, his reading glasses lowered halfway down his nose as he continued staring at the small silver name badge clipped to Evelyn's cardigan. Evelyn Carter. The name seemed to echo silently through his memory. Beside him, Professor Linda Avery slowly leaned closer. "Harold," she whispered carefully, "you are not thinking what I think you are." Whitmore swallowed hard without taking his eyes off Evelyn. "I have not heard that name in 15 years, he murmured. Meanwhile, Evelyn quietly lowered her gaze and resumed adjusting the journals on her cart as if she wanted nothing more than to disappear from the room entirely. That only irritated Dean Holloway further. He had spent decades controlling faculty rooms through confidence, pressure, and prestige. People were supposed to laugh when he laughed. The atmosphere was not supposed to shift away from him. Holloway straightened his posture and forced another polished smile. "Well," he said lightly, "I think we can all appreciate enthusiasm for academic discussion, regardless of department." A few scattered chuckles answered him, but the energy was weaker now. Something invisible had entered the room. Several older professors had begun whispering quietly among themselves while younger faculty looked confused by the sudden tension. Evelyn carefully turned her cart toward the side exit. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I did not mean to interrupt the symposium." Before she could leave, Holloway's voice stopped her. "Actually, Miss Carter," he said, his tone sharpening beneath the politeness, "perhaps you should stay." Evelyn paused near the aisle without turning around. Holloway walked slowly across the stage, slipping one hand into his pocket. "You seemed very confident about correcting my research publicly," he continued. "That is rather unusual for someone outside the academic faculty." The giant projection screen behind him still displayed his research framework in glowing blue graphs and equations. Hundreds of eyes shifted between the dean and the quiet woman standing beside a cart of dusty journals. Evelyn remained composed. "I was only commenting on the statistical sequence," she answered carefully. Holloway smiled again, but this time there was irritation behind it. "Only commenting," he repeated. "Interesting." He glanced toward the audience. "You know, one of the unfortunate side effects of working at a university is that proximity to expertise occasionally convinces people they possess it themselves." A few nervous laughs emerged from the back rows. Evelyn said nothing. That silence somehow unsettled the room even more. Holloway stepped closer to the edge of the stage. "Tell me, Miss Carter," he said, "where exactly did you study advanced predictive analytics?" The auditorium became completely still. Evelyn hesitated for only a second. "Blackstone University," she answered quietly. Several professors exchanged startled glances. Holloway raised an eyebrow. "Really? A long time ago. And did you complete your doctorate?" Holloway asked. Evelyn lowered her eyes slightly. No. Holloway nodded as though confirming a suspicion. "I see." His smile widened just enough to become dangerous. "Then perhaps we should remember the difference between attending a university and leading one." More laughter followed, but this time it sounded forced. Professor Whitmore no longer looked uncomfortable. He looked alarmed. Evelyn adjusted her grip on the cart handle. "You are right, Dean Holloway," she said softly. "There is a difference." Holloway tilted his head confidently. "I am glad we agree." But Evelyn's eyes finally lifted toward the massive research screen behind him. Calm. Steady. Unshaken. "One requires titles," she said quietly. "The other requires being correct." The room went silent again. For several long seconds, nobody inside the auditorium moved. Dean Holloway's smile remained frozen on his face, but the confidence behind it had begun to crack around the edges. Evelyn Carter stood quietly near the side aisle with one hand resting on the handle of her book cart, her expression calm while hundreds of eyes remained fixed on her. The silence felt heavier now, almost electric beneath the soft hum of the ceiling lights. Then a chair scraped suddenly across the front row. Professor Harold Whitmore rose to his feet slowly, still staring at Evelyn with visible disbelief. "Dean Holloway," he said carefully, "perhaps we should pause the symposium for a moment." Holloway blinked, caught off guard by the interruption. "I do not believe that is necessary," he replied smoothly, though irritation flickered beneath his voice. Whitmore ignored him. "Miss Carter," he asked quietly, "did you publish a paper in the Journal of Institutional Dynamics in 2009? The question rippled through the room like a shockwave. Several faculty members immediately looked up from their laptops. A few younger professors exchanged confused glances, but the older academics reacted differently. They knew that journal. Evelyn hesitated briefly before answering. "Yes," she said softly. A hush fell across the auditorium. Holloway frowned. "I am sorry," he interrupted with a short laugh. "Are we seriously discussing undergraduate publications during a faculty symposium?" "It was not undergraduate work," Whitmore replied sharply without looking at him. "That paper changed predictive academic modeling across 3 major institutions." The room became even quieter. Evelyn lowered her eyes again as though she regretted the attention entirely. Holloway's expression tightened. "I think we are drifting away from the purpose of tonight's event," he said firmly. But Professor Linda Avery had already opened her tablet with trembling fingers. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It is her." A few professors leaned closer toward Avery's screen. One by one, expressions shifted from confusion to stunned recognition. Even some graduate students began typing frantically into search engines beneath their desks. Holloway noticed the atmosphere slipping away from him and immediately stepped back toward center stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with forced confidence, "Blackstone University values intellectual curiosity, but let us not confuse nostalgia with expertise." He turned toward Evelyn again. "Whatever work you may have contributed 15 years ago, academia evolves. Modern institutional analytics are significantly more advanced than outdated theoretical speculation." Evelyn remained still for a moment before answering. "Some things evolve," she said quietly. "Truth does not." Holloway's jaw tightened visibly. He was no longer amused. He was angry. Deeply angry. Because for the first time in years, he no longer controlled the room. Faculty members who had applauded him 20 minutes earlier were now whispering among themselves instead. Several professors were no longer even looking at the stage. They were looking at Evelyn Carter. Holloway forced another measured smile and clasped his hands behind his back. "Very well," he said coolly. "Since Miss Carter appears eager to challenge my research publicly, perhaps we should settle this academically." The audience immediately fell silent again. Evelyn looked up slowly. Holloway continued, his voice carrying across the auditorium with deliberate authority. "Tomorrow evening, in this very hall, I will reopen this symposium before the full faculty board." He paused dramatically. "And if Miss Carter truly believes my methodology is flawed, she may present her argument before the entire university." Gasps spread quietly across the seating rows. Several faculty members looked horrified. Everyone understood exactly what Holloway was doing. This was no invitation. It was a trap. A public execution disguised as academic procedure. Holloway stared directly at Evelyn, confident she would retreat under pressure. "Of course," he added smoothly, "I understand if you would prefer not to embarrass yourself further." The room held its breath. Evelyn stood motionless beneath the chandelier light, her quiet figure almost swallowed by the massive auditorium around her. Then, without raising her voice, she answered, "I will be here." And for the first time that evening, Dean Richard Holloway stopped smiling. Completely. The symposium ended in fragments of whispers instead of applause. Faculty members who normally rushed to shake Dean Holloway's hand now lingered in uneasy clusters beneath the glowing chandeliers, speaking quietly while glancing toward the side exit where Evelyn Carter disappeared with her cart of journals. The atmosphere inside Blackstone University had changed completely in less than an hour. By the time Holloway returned to his office on the top floor of the administration building, rumors were already spreading across campus. Graduate assistants whispered in hallways. Professors reopened old research archives. Even students crowded online academic forums searching one question over and over again. Who was Evelyn Carter? Holloway slammed his office door harder than intended and loosened his tie with visible irritation. His office overlooked the entire campus through massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the stone courtyards below glowing beneath soft evening lights. Normally the view calmed him. Tonight it only sharpened his anger. He walked toward his desk where stacks of faculty recommendations and national committee letters waited beside a crystal tumbler of water. In 3 weeks, the National Academic Council would vote for its next executive chairman, and Holloway had spent years positioning himself for that role. Public humiliation was unacceptable. Especially from a woman everyone believed was a librarian. A knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Holloway said sharply. Professor Linda Avery stepped cautiously inside carrying a tablet against her chest. "Richard," she began carefully, "I think tomorrow night may not be a good idea." Holloway looked up coldly. "Excuse me?" Avery hesitated. "I reviewed the archives after the symposium. Evelyn Carter's 2009 paper was not minor work." Holloway leaned back slowly in his chair. "I am aware she published something years ago." "No," Avery replied quietly. "You do not understand. Her predictive framework became foundational in institutional analytics. MIT referenced her work. Stanford built entire models from it. Then she disappeared." Holloway's expression darkened slightly, but his voice remained controlled. "And yet somehow she ended up shelving books in our library basement." Avery stepped closer. "That should concern you more, not less." Holloway stood abruptly and walked toward the window overlooking campus. "Linda, do you know what happens when universities lose confidence in leadership?" he asked without turning around. "Chaos. Weakness. Public embarrassment." Avery said nothing. Holloway clasped his hands behind his back. "Tomorrow evening I will remind this faculty why credentials matter." "Richard, no," he interrupted firmly. "This woman challenged me publicly. If I back down now, the entire board will interpret it as weakness." Avery studied him carefully. "Or they may interpret it as wisdom." Holloway finally turned toward her, his patience gone. "Enough." The sharpness in his voice filled the office instantly. "I built this university's reputation with discipline and authority. I will not allow some forgotten academic ghost to undermine that because faculty members suddenly enjoy a little mystery." Avery lowered her eyes briefly. "You are making this personal." Holloway stepped closer to his desk. "It became personal the moment she questioned my research in front of the entire faculty." The room fell silent. Avery realized there was no changing his mind. Holloway was not preparing for academic discussion anymore. He was preparing for war through prestige, hierarchy, and humiliation. Across campus, meanwhile, Evelyn Carter quietly pushed her cart through the nearly empty library corridors beneath dim amber lights. The massive building had fallen silent except for the faint hum of ventilation systems and the soft squeak of cartwheels across polished floors. She moved carefully between endless rows of bookshelves while distant thunder rolled outside the tall stained glass windows. Most people would have assumed she was simply finishing another evening shift. But hidden inside a worn leather satchel beneath the cart rested several thick research binders filled with handwritten notes, mathematical corrections, and old academic drafts covered in faded ink. Evelyn paused beside a dark reading table and gently opened one of the binders. Her eyes settled on equations she had not looked at in over a decade. For a brief moment, pain crossed her face. Memories. Loss. Sacrifices nobody at Blackstone knew about. Then she quietly turned the page and continued reading while rain began tapping softly against the library windows. Because unlike Dean Holloway, Evelyn Carter was not preparing to protect her pride. She was preparing to tell the truth. By sunrise the next morning, Blackstone University no longer felt like the controlled academic institution Dean Holloway had ruled for years. It felt tense. Restless. Anticipating something nobody fully understood yet. Rain clouds drifted low over the stone buildings while students hurried across campus whispering rumors between classes. Faculty members who normally discussed grants and publications over coffee now spoke quietly about one name instead. Evelyn Carter. Inside the faculty lounge, the atmosphere had become almost surreal. Senior professors sat with tablets open beside untouched cups of coffee while archived academic journals covered the long oak table. "I cannot believe nobody recognized her sooner," one professor murmured. "She disappeared after the Princeton conference," another replied. "People thought she left academia permanently." Across the room, younger faculty members listened in confusion. One assistant professor finally asked the question everyone under 40 seemed afraid to ask. "Who exactly was she?" The room fell briefly silent before Professor Whitmore answered quietly. 15 years ago, Evelyn Carter was considered one of the brightest predictive theorists in the country. Several younger professors stared at him. Whitmore adjusted his glasses slowly. At 26, she published a framework so advanced that universities spent years trying to replicate it. "Then why is she working in the library basement?" someone whispered. No one answered immediately. Because nobody truly knew the full story. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of campus, Dean Holloway entered the administration building surrounded by strained silence. Staff members greeted him politely, but their expressions had changed. The admiration was gone. In its place lingered uncertainty. Holloway noticed every glance. Every whisper that stopped when he passed. His jaw tightened as he walked through the marble corridor toward his office. The previous night had already spread beyond campus. Clips from the symposium had surfaced online. Students had uploaded recordings of Evelyn correcting Holloway publicly, and the comments beneath the videos multiplied by the hour. Some mocked the dean. Others demanded to know why Blackstone University had hidden Evelyn Carter in a library position for years. Holloway dropped a folder onto his desk with visible frustration just as his assistant entered nervously. "Sir," she said carefully, "the faculty board has requested attendance tonight." Holloway barely looked up. "Of course they have. There is also a call from the National Academic Council." That made him pause. His expression hardened immediately. "What did they say?" "Only that they are monitoring the situation closely." The words hung heavily in the room. Holloway slowly leaned back in his chair. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar pressing against his confidence. Fear. Not fear of Evelyn herself. Fear of losing authority. Losing reputation. Losing the future he had spent decades building. He rose abruptly and walked toward the massive bookshelf behind his desk where framed awards and honorary photographs lined the walls. Governors. Senators. University presidents. Powerful people respected Richard Holloway because he never lost control. And tonight, he intended to regain it publicly. Across campus, Evelyn sat alone inside a quiet archive room beneath the library. Soft fluorescent lights illuminated rows of old storage cabinets while stacks of handwritten notes covered the table before her. She wore the same faded cardigan from the symposium, and her expression remained calm despite the storm growing around her. Beside her rested an old leather folder stamped with faded gold lettering from Blackstone University dated nearly 16 years earlier. Slowly, she opened it. Inside were recommendation letters, conference credentials, research drafts, and one photograph partially hidden beneath the papers. A younger Evelyn stood beside another scholar smiling beneath bright conference lights. Her husband, Daniel Carter. For a moment, her composure cracked slightly. Grief passed quietly through her eyes before she looked away. Daniel had believed she would change academia forever. Then came the accident. Then came hospital rooms. Medical debt. Sleepless nights beside their young son's treatments. One sacrifice after another until research no longer mattered. Survival did. Evelyn gently closed the folder and stared silently at the rain sliding down the basement windows. Upstairs, students and faculty debated her legacy like gossip. But none of them understood the truth. Evelyn Carter had never wanted fame. She had walked away from brilliance willingly. Which was exactly why Dean Holloway had made the biggest mistake of his life. Because people obsessed with power rarely recognize those who no longer need it. By late afternoon, every seat inside Blackstone University's grand auditorium had been filled. Faculty members crowded the front rows while graduate students lined the walls shoulder to shoulder, whispering nervously beneath the soft gold chandelier light. The atmosphere no longer resembled an academic symposium. It felt like a reckoning. Outside the tall arched windows, storm clouds rolled slowly across the darkening sky while camera crews from local education networks gathered near the building entrance. What had started as a faculty dispute had become something much larger overnight. At precisely 6 o'clock, Dean Richard Holloway entered through the side doors wearing a charcoal suit and silver tie, his posture rigid with controlled authority. Conversations immediately lowered into silence as he walked toward the stage. Holloway understood appearances better than anyone. His expression remained calm, confident, untouchable. But beneath that polished exterior, pressure was tightening around him from every direction. The National Academic Council had postponed his executive review pending the outcome of tonight's hearing. 3 board members had already requested copies of his research documentation. And worst of all, several senior professors had stopped answering his calls. Entirely. Holloway placed a leather folder onto the podium and adjusted the microphone carefully. "Good evening," he announced smoothly. "Blackstone University has always valued intellectual rigor, which is why I agreed to reopen this discussion publicly." His eyes swept across the audience. Truth should never fear examination. The statement sounded noble enough to earn scattered applause, but the tension inside the room did not ease. Because everyone knew tonight was no longer about research. It was about credibility. Holloway opened his presentation immediately, filling the giant screens with graphs, equations, and predictive models glowing blue against the dark auditorium walls. His voice grew stronger as he spoke. Controlled. Technical. Commanding. For nearly 20 minutes, he dissected his methodology with the precision of a man reclaiming dominance. Some faculty members nodded along again. Others looked unconvinced but remained silent. Then the side doors opened quietly. The room shifted instantly. Evelyn Carter entered carrying nothing except a worn leather satchel held close against her side. She wore the same faded gray cardigan, the same simple blouse, the same calm expression that had unsettled the university the night before. Yet somehow, tonight, she no longer looked invisible. Conversations died immediately as every eye followed her slow walk down the side aisle. Holloway paused mid-sentence but recovered quickly. "Miss Carter," he said with thin politeness, "how kind of you to join us." Evelyn stopped near the front row. "You invited me." A few nervous chuckles echoed through the room before silence returned again. Holloway gestured toward the stage with theatrical courtesy. "Please," he said. "We are all eager to hear your concerns regarding my work." Several professors exchanged uneasy glances. The trap was obvious now. Holloway intended to overwhelm her publicly with complexity, terminology, and institutional pressure until the audience remembered who held authority. Evelyn walked slowly toward the stage while the soft sound of her footsteps echoed through the auditorium. Holloway stepped aside from the podium but kept one hand resting possessively against it. "Before we begin," he said, "perhaps you should clarify your qualifications for the audience." The question carried deliberate weight. Everyone understood the implication. Holloway wanted the room reminded that Evelyn held no current academic title, no active professorship, no institutional power. Evelyn looked toward the audience briefly before answering. "I have not worked in academia for many years." Holloway nodded immediately as though confirming victory. "Exactly." But Evelyn calmly placed her satchel onto the podium table and opened it. One by one, she removed thick folders filled with handwritten research notes, archived publications, and original statistical models covered in faded annotations. Several professors leaned forward instantly. Professor Whitmore's eyes widened in disbelief. Holloway's expression tightened slightly. Evelyn carefully placed one final document onto the table. A faded conference program from 15 years earlier bearing her name in bold print beneath the title Keynote Speaker. A hush fell across the auditorium. Evelyn finally looked directly at Holloway for the first time that evening. Her voice remained soft. "You asked for qualifications," she said calmly. "I brought the originals." The room went completely silent. For a moment, Dean Holloway simply stared at the documents spread across the podium table as if his mind refused to process what he was seeing. The faded conference program alone was enough to make several senior professors shift uncomfortably in their seats. They remembered that conference. 15 years earlier, universities across the country had fought for invitations after a 26-year-old researcher stunned the academic world with a predictive framework decades ahead of its time. Evelyn Carter had not merely participated in those discussions. She had led them. The auditorium remained silent except for the soft hum of the projection screens behind the stage. Holloway recovered first. He straightened his posture and forced a measured smile back onto his face. "Impressive memorabilia," he said coolly. "But old conference appearances do not invalidate current institutional modeling." Evelyn looked at him calmly. "No," she agreed softly. "Mathematics does." A ripple moved through the audience. Holloway's jaw tightened slightly. "Very well," he replied. "Please explain to the faculty where my methodology fails." The challenge hung in the air like a final warning. Holloway folded his arms confidently beside the podium, fully expecting Evelyn to stumble beneath the pressure of live academic scrutiny. Instead, she quietly stepped toward the giant projection screen and studied the equations for several seconds without speaking. The silence itself became unsettling. Every professor in the room leaned forward waiting for her first mistake. It never came. Evelyn reached for the digital stylus beside the podium and circled a section of Holloway's framework. "Your predictive weighting collapses under longitudinal instability," she said calmly. "Specifically here." Holloway immediately interrupted. "That assumption has already been peer-reviewed by committees using compressed enrollment cycles," Evelyn replied softly without raising her voice. "Not true long-range institutional decline patterns." A few professors exchanged startled glances. Evelyn continued writing small corrections directly onto the projected equation. Her movements were steady, precise, unhurried. "You adjusted the variance compression to create stronger short-term outcomes," she explained. "That makes the projections appear stable for approximately 3 to 5 years. Holloway smirked slightly. "Exactly." Evelyn finally looked at him. "And after year 7, the entire model begins producing false institutional recovery indicators." The room went still. Holloway opened his mouth to respond, But Professor Avery suddenly leaned toward her laptop with widened eyes. "Wait," she whispered. "Run the 7th-year expansion." Several faculty analysts began typing rapidly across the auditorium. The sound of keyboards filled the silence. Holloway's confidence flickered for the first time. Evelyn stepped back from the screen and folded her hands quietly in front of her. She was not performing. She was explaining. That difference changed everything. One graduate researcher near the back stood abruptly. "The decline curve spikes after year 7, he said nervously. Another professor checked his tablet and looked pale. "She is right." Whispering spread instantly through the room. Holloway raised his voice sharply. "The model accounts for long-term institutional adaptation." Evelyn shook her head gently. "No. Your revised weighting hides the adaptation failure temporarily. It does not solve it." Holloway stepped toward the podium again. "You are oversimplifying an extremely advanced predictive structure." Evelyn calmly opened one of her old research folders and removed several handwritten pages covered in equations. "Actually," she said softly, "you simplified mine." Silence crashed through the auditorium. Holloway froze mid-step. Evelyn placed the pages beside his presentation files. "Your entire stabilization framework is derived from my 2009 continuity structure," she explained quietly. "Including the modified weighting sequence you presented last night." Several professors immediately stood from their seats trying to see the documents more clearly. Professor Whitmore removed his glasses completely and stared at the equations in disbelief. The similarities were undeniable. Holloway's face slowly lost color beneath the stage lights. "That is absurd," he snapped. But his voice no longer carried authority. It carried panic. Evelyn did not react emotionally. She simply turned another page. "You altered the recovery variables to improve short-term administrative projections," she continued calmly. "But doing so introduced the same collapse point I warned against 15 years ago." One by one, faculty members began comparing the documents on their own screens. Murmurs spread rapidly now. Some looked stunned. Others looked betrayed. Holloway glanced across the audience and realized something terrifying. Nobody was looking at him anymore. They were listening to her. And for the first time in his career, Dean Richard Holloway had absolutely no control over the room. The auditorium no longer sounded like a place of academic certainty. It sounded like people realizing they had witnessed something they could not explain away. Faculty members spoke over one another in hushed disbelief while glowing laptop screens illuminated stunned faces across the room. Dean Holloway remained beside the podium beneath the harsh stage lights, but the authority he had carried into the auditorium was dissolving minute by minute. Evelyn Carter stood quietly near the projection screen with her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, calm in a way that only made the contrast more devastating. Professor Whitmore slowly approached the stage carrying a printed copy of Evelyn's original 2009 publication beside Holloway's current research proposal. His hands trembled slightly as he compared the pages side by side. "The structural sequence is identical," he said quietly into the silence. "Even the recovery assumptions follow the same progression." A murmur swept across the faculty rows. Holloway immediately stepped forward. "Predictive modeling often overlaps conceptually," he argued sharply. "That does not constitute misconduct." But his voice no longer sounded composed. It sounded defensive. Evelyn looked toward the audience instead of him. "Overlap is common," she agreed softly. "Replication without attribution is not." The room fell silent again. Holloway's expression hardened instantly. "Are you accusing me of plagiarism?" The question echoed across the auditorium. Evelyn paused briefly before answering. "I am stating that your revised framework contains my original continuity structure with altered variables and omitted citations." Several professors visibly recoiled. One board member seated near the front whispered something urgently to another administrator while checking documents on a tablet. Holloway laughed suddenly, but the sound landed hollow and strained. "This is absurd," he snapped. "Do you seriously expect this faculty to believe I built my career by stealing unpublished work from someone who abandoned academia?" Evelyn's expression did not change. "The paper was not unpublished." Holloway froze. Evelyn reached into her satchel again and removed another document sealed inside a protective sleeve. The revised continuity structure was submitted to the National Predictive Systems Conference 16 years ago. She carefully handed the paper to Professor Avery. "Including the exact collapse warnings your model now produces." Avery scanned the document for only a few seconds before her face drained of color completely. "Richard," she whispered, "the timestamp predates your framework by almost a decade." A stunned hush swept through the auditorium. Holloway's breathing visibly changed now. Faster. Less controlled. He stepped toward Avery and grabbed the document from her hands. His eyes moved rapidly across the pages while faculty members watched him in complete silence. Then came the moment that shattered the room entirely. One graduate analyst near the back raised his trembling hand. "Dean Holloway," he said nervously, "I reran the university forecast using Professor Carter's original weighting instead of yours." Nobody corrected him for calling her professor. "And?" Professor Whitmore asked quietly. The young analyst swallowed hard. "Her model predicts the financial collapse risk accurately." Silence. "Your version hides it for 6 years." The room went completely still. Holloway stared forward without speaking. The projection screens behind him suddenly looked less like evidence of brilliance and more like proof of manipulation. Several faculty board members exchanged grim expressions. One administrator quietly closed his folder altogether. Another removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead slowly. The atmosphere had shifted beyond repair now. This was no longer a debate. It was an exposure. Evelyn finally stepped away from the screen and looked directly at Holloway. Her voice remained calm, almost compassionate. "You were so determined to protect the university's image that you stopped protecting the truth." Holloway opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out immediately. For the first time in decades, Richard Holloway stood before an audience without language powerful enough to save him. The silence around him felt enormous. Crushing. Then Professor Whitmore rose slowly to his feet. "I move for an immediate independent review of Dean Holloway's research submissions and administrative conduct." Another professor stood. Seconded. Then another. And another. One by one, faculty members across the auditorium began rising from their seats in silent agreement while Holloway remained frozen beneath the stage lights. The same room that had laughed with him the night before now refused even to look at him. And in the center of it all stood Evelyn Carter, still wearing the same faded gray cardigan, still speaking softly, still carrying herself without arrogance. Because she had never come there to destroy a man. She had only come to stop a lie. By the time the faculty council had convened formally after the initial confrontation, the atmosphere inside Blackstone University's grand auditorium had transformed completely. The chandeliers above cast warm golden light over rows of standing professors, graduate students, and staff, all now focused entirely on Evelyn Carter. Her calm presence contrasted sharply with the tension radiating from Dean Richard Holloway, whose usual air of control had dissipated entirely. The council began their review by examining the documents Evelyn had presented the previous evening, her original research papers meticulously annotated, her continuity structures carefully preserved, and her predictive models laid bare for scrutiny. One by one, the council members verified her claims, cross-referencing dates, equations, and original conference submissions. Each verification amplified the collective shock. Holloway stood silently to the side, hands gripping the podium, as murmurs rippled through the room. Professors whispered quietly to one another, their expressions shifting from disbelief to acknowledgement, and then to a cautious respect. The graduate students typed furiously on laptops, capturing every moment, documenting a revelation that would circulate beyond campus by morning. Evelyn moved calmly among the front rows, answering questions with precise explanations, never raising her voice, never displaying pride, only clarity. Your methodology did not account for longitudinal instability, she explained, gesturing to one of the projection screens. This is what introduces the false stability in your projected models. Holloway's mouth opened, then closed, the words failing him. Several senior faculty members exchanged subtle glances. One older professor stepped forward. Dean Holloway, he said softly, these findings are incontrovertible. We must acknowledge Professor Carter's precedence in this research. Holloway's face paled slightly, and he straightened his tie without speaking. Evelyn continued methodically, pointing out each adjustment Holloway had made to her original work, demonstrating how minor alterations had produced temporary appearances of stability that masked the underlying flaws. Every point was verifiable, every statement clear, leaving no room for dispute. The entire faculty council was now silent except for Evelyn's quiet explanations and the faint hum of the projector. After nearly an hour, the president of the council, a distinguished professor of economics, cleared his throat and addressed the room. It is evident that Evelyn Carter's original research framework was foundational to the models Dean Holloway has presented. Her corrections and observations are accurate and must be formally recognized. A collective intake of breath swept through the auditorium. Holloway's lips pressed tightly together, a rare loss of composure marking his expression. Evelyn stepped back from the screen, her hands folded calmly in front of her, and looked directly at him. I am not here to diminish anyone, she said softly. I am here to ensure that truth is preserved in our work. The president nodded, signaling the end of the formal review. Faculty members began to stand, some approaching Evelyn to offer quiet congratulations, others nodding solemnly, acknowledging her authority and expertise. The graduate students whispered among themselves, still taking notes, still awed by the demonstration of intellect and composure. Holloway remained at the podium, silent and still, his presence no longer commanding the room. Evelyn quietly gathered her folders and returned them to her satchel, a serene smile barely perceptible on her lips. She did not linger for applause. She did not seek recognition. Her work had spoken for itself. The council adjourned formally, the echoes of acknowledgement lingering in the marble halls long after the audience had dispersed. In that moment, the university remembered not just Evelyn Carter's brilliance, but also a quiet lesson: authority can command attention, but integrity and truth earn enduring respect.